What if the world you were taught to imagine before industrialization was incomplete, or worse, carefully simplified? What if massive production existed long before smokestacks, assembly lines, and steam engines, operating quietly, efficiently, and then disappearing from the official record? And if that were true, why was it never explained to us this way? As you listen, leave a comment with your thoughts, because this story challenges assumptions most of us never questioned. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your perspective in the comments. Your participation helps this conversation stay alive, especially when the subject makes people uncomfortable. Between the early 18th century and the middle of the 19th century, vast regions often associated with what later writers would call Tartaria displayed signs of large-scale production. Roads, canals, monumental cities, standardized architecture, textiles, metalwork, ceramics, and agricultural output existed on a scale that seems difficult to reconcile with the absence of factories as we understand them today. There are no clear records of sprawling industrial complexes, no endless rows of smokestacks, no centralized manufacturing hubs dominating the landscape, and yet the goods existed, moved, and were consumed in enormous quantities. This raises a quiet but unsettling question. If factories were not responsible, then how were these products made? The modern mind is trained to equate production with industrial concentration. We imagine labor compressed into massive buildings, powered by machines, driven by fossil fuels, managed through rigid hierarchies. But this model is relatively recent. Before it became dominant, production followed a very different logic, one that emphasized distribution rather than concentration, skill rather than mechanization, and local autonomy rather than centralized control. In many regions linked to Tartaria, evidence suggests a vast network of localized workshops, family-based labor units, guild-like structures, and mobile specialists. Instead of one factory employing thousands, there may have been tens of thousands of small production points operating simultaneously. Each workshop produced components, materials, or finished goods according to shared standards, allowing everything to fit together seamlessly across enormous distances. This system did not rely on smokestacks or heavy machinery. It relied on knowledge passed through generations, precise handcraft, natural energy sources such as water, wind, and gravity, and a deep understanding of materials. When production is spread across landscapes instead of compressed into cities, it leaves a very different archaeological footprint, one that is easier to overlook or misinterpret centuries later. Textiles are one of the clearest examples. Cloth production on a massive scale existed long before industrial looms dominated Europe. Homes doubled as workspaces. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, and finishing were distributed among entire communities. When these outputs are later observed without context, historians often assume early industrialization, yet the physical factories themselves are missing. Metal production tells a similar story. Tools, weapons, architectural components, and decorative elements appear standardized and abundant. This suggests coordination, not chaos. Distributed foundries, small furnaces, and itinerant metalworkers could collectively produce volumes rivaling later industrial output, all without the visual signatures we associate with factories. As centralized industrial models expanded across the Old World, these older systems were gradually dismantled. New economic structures favored ownership concentration, wage labor, and resource extraction on an unprecedented scale. Distributed production, once resilient and adaptable, became inefficient within the new framework. It was pushed aside, regulated out of existence, or absorbed without acknowledgement. Here is where the record becomes strangely quiet. When industrialization narratives were written, earlier systems were often minimized or erased. Output that had once been normal suddenly appeared miraculous when attributed to new machines alone. The impression was created that production exploded almost overnight, as if humanity had been waiting in stagnation until steam power arrived to save it. But what if that explosion was not a beginning, but a takeover? Some researchers suggest that as industrial economies consolidated power, older production methods were intentionally excluded from official economic histories. Not necessarily through a single coordinated effort, but through bureaucratic neglect, reclassification, and the simple rewriting of how progress was defined. What did not fit the factory model was labeled primitive, informal, or irrelevant, even if it had sustained entire civilizations. And this leads to a final thought worth sitting with. If a vast, efficient pre-industrial production system once existed in plain sight, and if it was later erased from memory, what else might have been lost along with it? What knowledge, what techniques, what social structures quietly vanished when the factory became king? The evidence does not scream, it whispers, and as we continue, those whispers begin to form patterns that are difficult to ignore, especially when we look closer at the cities, infrastructure, and economic transitions that followed. Let me know in the comments what you think so far, because what comes next takes us deeper into how this system may have actually functioned on a daily level and why its disappearance was anything but accidental. Daily production within these regions did not revolve around a single clock or a central authority issuing commands. Instead, time itself was organized differently. Work followed natural cycles rather than mechanical schedules. Seasonal rhythms dictated output, and communities adjusted collectively, allowing production to expand or contract without collapsing the entire system. This flexibility is one of the reasons it functioned so effectively without leaving behind the rigid infrastructure historians expect to see. Villages were not merely residential spaces, they were production nodes. A single settlement might specialize in finishing textiles, while another focused on preparing raw fibers, and a third handled dye extraction and treatment. Goods moved continuously along roads and waterways, not toward a single destination, but through a flowing network where value was added step by step. When viewed from above, it resembled a living organism rather than an industrial machine. Transportation played a crucial role, and here the infrastructure becomes especially revealing. Canals, stone roads, river ports, and engineered waterways existed long before modern industrial expansion reached these territories. These routes were not built to serve factories, but they enabled high-volume circulation of materials nonetheless. The absence of factories does not indicate an absence of industry. It suggests a different definition of it. Energy use followed the same decentralized logic. Water wheels powered milling, grinding, and mechanical processes across vast distances. Wind systems, often embedded into architecture itself, assisted with ventilation, lifting, and material handling. Gravity-fed systems reduced the need for external power altogether. When energy is embedded into the environment, it does not leave behind coal residue or towering chimneys. It leaves behind stonework, channels, and foundations that are easily mistaken for purely architectural features. Skilled labor was the backbone of this system. Instead of replacing artisans with machines, the system multiplied their effectiveness. Standardization existed, but it was enforced through shared knowledge rather than mechanical precision. Measurements, proportions, and techniques were taught orally and through apprenticeship, ensuring compatibility across regions without the need for centralized enforcement. This challenges a deeply ingrained assumption. Modern narratives often portray pre-industrial societies as inefficient and limited by human labor alone. But efficiency does not require machines. It requires coordination. And coordination can exist without bureaucracy if cultural systems are aligned toward cooperation rather than competition. At some point, however, this alignment fractured. As centralized states expanded and financial systems evolved, production began to be measured differently. Value was no longer defined solely by usefulness or durability, but by scalability, ownership, and profit concentration. Distributed systems, by their nature, resist monopolization. They are harder to tax, harder to control, and harder to convert into abstract financial instruments. This is where things begin to feel less accidental. Records from the period show a sudden emphasis on factories as symbols of progress. Production that did not occur within their walls was increasingly dismissed as informal or invisible. Entire populations who had once been producers were reclassified as laborers, expected to sell their time rather than their skill. Economic data starts to appear cleaner, simpler, and more centralized, but also less reflective of reality. Old workshops disappeared from maps. Trade routes were redirected. Skills once considered essential were labeled obsolete, and when later historians looked back, they saw a gap, a void that made it seem as though industrial output emerged from nowhere. The distributed system that preceded it had been absorbed, dismantled, or forgotten. Some find it strange that so little resistance is discussed in official accounts. When livelihoods vanish, people notice, yet the transition is often described as inevitable, almost natural. Progress, we are told, simply marched forward. But progress for whom, and at what cost? There are moments where the silence becomes louder than the evidence, architectural remnants that do not align with known economic models. Cities appearing fully formed, with infrastructure that suggests long-term planning rather than sudden industrial growth. Production volumes that seem excessive for the supposedly primitive tools attributed to the era. This is where speculation begins to creep in, and perhaps that is exactly why the topic remains uncomfortable. If earlier systems were more advanced than acknowledged, then the story of human development becomes less linear, less controllable. It introduces the possibility that knowledge can be lost, not just gained, and that history may not be a straight climb upward, but a series of resets. And as we move forward, attention shifts to the physical evidence itself, the buildings, the layouts, the materials, and the anomalies that refuse to sit neatly inside accepted timelines. Because when you look closely enough, patterns start to emerge, and they point towards something far more organized than coincidence. Share your thoughts below as we continue, because the next part examines what remains in plain sight today, quietly contradicting the official narrative and raising questions that grow harder to dismiss. What still stands today may be the most revealing part of this entire story. Long after the workshops went quiet and the networks dissolved, the physical environments they depended on remained. Cities across regions once associated with Tartaria display infrastructure that appears strangely overqualified for the populations and economic models officially assigned to them. Wide boulevards, massive drainage systems, uniform building techniques, and architectural symmetry suggest planning on a scale that exceeds what fragmented, pre-industrial societies are assumed to possess. These cities were not built around factories, yet they functioned as production hubs. Storage spaces, integrated water systems, ventilation channels, and modular construction point toward environments designed to support continuous activity. Many structures labeled as palaces, administrative buildings, or purely ceremonial spaces may have served practical roles that are no longer understood or acknowledged. Stone construction is particularly telling. Quarrying, transporting, shaping, and assembling massive stone components requires coordination, precision, and time. The volume of stonework found across these regions implies sustained production over generations. And yet, when historians attempt to explain how this was achieved, they often rely on vague references to manual labor without addressing the logistics involved. Even more curious is the uniformity. Architectural styles repeat across vast distances with remarkable consistency. This suggests shared standards, shared knowledge, and an organized system of training and replication. It resembles an industrial mindset without industrial machinery, a civilization capable of mass production without factories. Then there are the buildings that appear misclassified, structures with thick walls, internal channels, unusual floor plans, and unexplained mechanical features are often described as storage, religious, or defensive by default. But those labels do not always fit. Some of these features align more closely with environmental regulation, material processing, or energy control than with symbolism or warfare. At this point, questions naturally arise. Why would so much functional infrastructure be reinterpreted as decorative or ceremonial? Why do historical explanations stop short of exploring alternative uses? And why does the idea of advanced pre-industrial systems trigger such resistance? This is where the narrative edges closer to controversy. If earlier societies possessed methods of production that did not rely on combustion or centralized factories, then industrialization was not a discovery, but a replacement, a shift in control rather than capability. Centralized factories consolidate labor, resources, and power. Distributed systems do not. They empower communities instead of institutions. Some argue that this made the older system incompatible with emerging political and financial structures. As nation-states and global trade networks expanded, a decentralized economy became an obstacle. Standardizing labor under factory roofs simplified taxation, regulation, and ownership. In that context, erasing the memory of alternative systems may not have required malice, only convenience. Still, the speed of the transition remains difficult to ignore. Within a few generations, skills that had sustained civilizations were gone. Knowledge was fragmented. Production became dependent on external energy sources. Cities were reshaped to accommodate factories rather than people, and the story of what came before was compressed into a footnote. Maps from the period, add another layer of intrigue. Regions once labeled broadly and confidently begin to fragment, renamed and redefined. Tartaria fades from usage, replaced by new borders and identities. With that shift, continuity breaks. What was once a connected system becomes a series of isolated histories. Is it possible that the disappearance of Tartaria from maps coincides with the disappearance of its production model from memory? The question alone is enough to unsettle comfortable assumptions. None of this proves a single hidden hand directing history, but it does suggest selective storytelling. History written by frameworks that favor centralization, industrial dominance, and linear progress. Frameworks that struggle to accommodate systems that do not fit their logic. As we move forward, the focus turns to why these questions are resurfacing now, why researchers, independent historians, and curious observers are re-examining familiar structures with unfamiliar eyes, and why the idea of lost systems resonates so strongly in a world increasingly dependent on fragile, centralized networks. Leave your thoughts as we continue, because the next part explores the suppression, reinterpretation, and quiet dismissal of these ideas, and what that says about how knowledge itself is controlled. The way these ideas are treated today may be just as revealing as the evidence itself. When alternative interpretations of pre-industrial production are raised, they are often dismissed quickly, not through detailed refutation, but through labeling, speculative, fringe, conspiratorial. These words act as barriers, discouraging deeper examination before the questions are fully explored. And yet, history has shown many times that dominant narratives are not always complete narratives. Academic frameworks depend heavily on documented transitions. If something cannot be traced cleanly through paperwork, official records, or institutional continuity, it is often assumed not to have existed at scale. But distributed systems do not leave behind the same paper trails as centralized ones. They rely on shared practice rather than centralized reporting. When such systems dissolve, their memory fades rapidly, especially if the new order has no incentive to preserve it. In the case of Tartaria, much of what is known comes from indirect sources: maps, architecture, travel accounts, and inconsistencies between physical evidence and written explanation. Critics argue that the absence of direct documentation proves the absence of the system itself. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the transition period coincides with widespread political restructuring, wars, border changes, and the standardization of education. Education itself plays a critical role here. Once industrialization became the benchmark for progress, earlier systems were reframed as primitive stepping stones rather than parallel paths. Students learned to see history as a straight line, leading inevitably to factories, machines, and centralized power. Anything that complicated that line was simplified or removed. This creates a feedback loop. New generations of historians are trained within the same framework, reinforcing assumptions rather than questioning them. Over time, the questions stop being asked altogether, and when they reappear, they sound radical simply because they have been absent for so long. There is also the issue of practicality. Accepting that large-scale production once existed without factories forces uncomfortable comparisons. It raises questions about sustainability, resilience, and autonomy. It challenges the idea that technological progress must always move toward greater centralization and resource extraction, and it suggests that alternatives not only existed, but worked. For some, that implication is more threatening than any conspiracy. It is easier to believe that industrialization was the only possible path forward than to consider that it may have replaced something equally capable but less controllable. In that light, the marginalization of pre-industrial distributed systems becomes understandable, even predictable. Still, patterns continue to surface. Restoration projects uncover mechanical features no one expected. Urban excavations reveal layers that contradict accepted timelines. Old buildings resist easy classification. Each discovery alone can be dismissed. Together they form a tension that never fully resolves. And then there is the modern parallel. As digital technologies enable decentralized production once again through small-scale manufacturing, open-source design, and local fabrication, the past begins to feel strangely familiar. What was once labeled obsolete starts to resemble a lost blueprint rather than a dead end. This may explain why interest in Tartaria and similar topics has surged in recent years, not because of a desire to rewrite history for its own sake, but because the present feels unstable. Centralized systems show signs of fragility, supply chains fracture, energy dependence becomes a liability, and suddenly the idea that entire civilizations once produced abundantly without factories feels less implausible and more relevant. As this perspective gains traction, resistance intensifies. The louder the questions become, the firmer the dismissals. That dynamic alone suggests the subject touches something deeper than mere academic disagreement. And this brings us to the final question that lingers beneath everything discussed so far. If history filters out systems that do not align with current power structures, how much of what we believe about progress is shaped not by truth, but by convenience? The final part ties these threads together, not to provide definitive answers, but to examine what acknowledging these possibilities might change about how we understand the past, the present, and the choices ahead. When all these elements are viewed together, a different picture of the past begins to take shape. Not a hidden empire powered by impossible technology, but a civilization organized around principles that no longer align with modern assumptions. Production without factories was not an anomaly. It was a system optimized for its environment, its resources, and its social structure. The disappearance of that system does not require a single dramatic event. It only requires a shift in priorities. When centralized industry proved more profitable, more controllable, and more compatible with expanding financial systems, it became the standard by which all productivity was measured. Everything else slowly faded from relevance, then from memory. What once functioned as a network became fragmented. What once depended on shared knowledge became dependent on machinery. What once empowered communities became a source of centralized authority. Over time, the language of progress replaced the language of balance, and the past was reframed accordingly. This reframing explains why Tartaria feels elusive. It is not hidden behind locked doors or secret archives. It is hidden in plain sight, embedded in buildings we mislabel, infrastructure we underappreciate, and timelines we accept without question. The story was not erased so much as overwritten, and perhaps that is the most important realization. History does not disappear. It is reorganized. The lens changes, and with it, what we are able to see. Acknowledging that large-scale production once existed without factories does not mean rejecting modern technology. It means recognizing that progress is not singular. Multiple systems can coexist, rise and fall based on circumstances rather than superiority. When one system replaces another, the loser is rarely remembered kindly, if at all. The silence around pre-industrial distributed production may say less about its effectiveness and more about its incompatibility with the world that followed. A world that values speed over resilience, ownership over stewardship, and growth over continuity. This perspective also reframes the suddenness of industrialization. It was not humanity awakening from ignorance. It was a redirection, a consolidation, an absorption of existing output into a new structure that claimed authorship over progress itself. Once you see it this way, the question is no longer whether Tartaria needed factories. The question becomes why factories needed Tartaria to be forgotten, not because of a grand secret, but because narratives shape legitimacy, and legitimacy determines who controls labor, resources, and memory. Today, as centralized systems strain under their own complexity, interest in forgotten models grows. People look backward not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. The past becomes a laboratory of alternatives, reminding us that the way things are is not the only way they have ever been. Whether Tartaria was a unified civilization or a label for many interconnected regions matters less than what its remnants suggest. That human societies once achieved scale, coordination, and abundance without the industrial footprint we now consider unavoidable. That idea alone is enough to unsettle certainty, and perhaps that is where this story truly ends. Not with definitive conclusions, but with an open space. A space where questions are allowed to exist without immediate dismissal, where history is not a fixed script, but a living investigation. If production once thrived without factories, then the limits we accept today may not be as absolute as we think. And if entire systems can vanish from memory, then rediscovering them begins with a simple act most powerful of all, looking again.